You're watching Unrendered on IKTV. I'm Tony Regisford, and my guest is, I nearly said the Honorable, not yet. She was a senator at one point, but I'm speaking to the leader of the Democratic Republican Party, Miss Anesia Baptiste. Anesia, I went through the papers today, and I picked up a letter writer saying hooliganism in the Church of God. Of course, they're referring to the incident at the funeral of Eduardo Lynch.
Okay.
What are your views on the whole thing? I'm just going to give you a blank check here with my signature. What are your views?
I think the display which took place, which I read about, heard about, etc., because I wasn't there, but from all accounts, you know, video evidence, audio, etc., it was most unfortunate. First of all, I want to take the opportunity to extend my condolences to Miss Shafia London Williams and her family on the passing of their father, Mr. E.G. Lynch, whom I knew, with whom I interacted, and who actually gave me advice when I was a member of the NDP. And it is really unfortunate that a situation like a funeral, where a family was grieving the loss of their father, was turned into what it was turned into. But you see, it is evident to me that it was planned. I read the comments and what I would call the incitement to that kind of behavior that were put on Facebook by persons who are considered to be pieces for the NDP. I read them days before.
Are you putting
I saw them
the
for
blame
myself.
wholly and squarely on the NDP, defeated the NDP for that?
Well, I'll put it this way. While when you say the feat of the NDP, I assume you're talking about the leadership. I assume you're talking about the leadership
and the leadership hierarchy.
All right. Well, one, there was evidence that people were incited to that behavior days before. I am not aware that the leadership, the leader of the NDP, knowing about that, made any call for persons not to go and do that. There was a call for people to boo the Prime Minister if he comes in. There was a call for them to, if he goes up to talk, to get up and boo him and walk out in a noisy manner. Those are words that were used in the incitement on Facebook. And I didn't hear any member of the leadership of the NDP, I could be wrong, call them out and say, don't do that. That is not a position of the NDP. We don't expect that behavior from you at the funeral come Saturday. And then, subsequently, we had membership, we had leadership of the NDP justifying what the people had done. The Honorable Andy Musa himself is on record as answering the Searchlight newspaper in saying that they were exercising their democratic rights.
But what, man?
Your right ends where my right begins. Wasn't Shafia and her brother, wasn't it their democratic right to have a funeral service in memory of their father without disturbance, where they have to actually be asking people to be quiet, to calm themselves? This is not the place for that. So if the people who were booing and ringing bell and carrying on, if they were exercising their democratic rights, then when Miss London and her brother asked them to stop, were they interfering with the exercising of their democratic rights? And what about their democratic rights, who wanted a peaceful and quiet funeral? I mean,
but let's look at
this thing, I brought that in because I wanted to say, in answering your question about blame, that if you don't want blame, then how come you could justify it after? Then what are you saying? You're saying they're right to do what they did, and you're saying you support what they did.
I'm not sure that's what he's saying, but let's look at...
Well, if he's not saying that, he would be saying he's against the exercising of democratic rights.
Let's just look at E.G. Lynch and the fact, yes, he is the father of Shafia, and her brother was there. And so it was a family thing on the one hand.
Correct.
But E.G. Lynch became a public figure.
Yes,
right?
He's still
and the beacon of the NDP party, somebody that they held dear to their hearts.
That doesn't justify their behavior in the church. That doesn't justify their disregarding the sentiments of the family, asking for That doesn't justify them not displaying conscience, to even be sensitive. It is a death, it is a funeral, for goodness sake, Tony. So whether or not you felt strongly about whatever disagreement and so on that would have taken place between Mr. Lynch and the Prime Minister, whether or not you felt strongly about that, the family exercised their right to choose to invite the Prime Minister to the funeral.
Should the Prime Minister
and to
have been
ask him to
sensitive
speak.
to being, you know, a knowledgeable and worldly man? Should he have been sensitive to the fact that, listen, you know what, Shafia, I thank you for the invitation, but my presence there may cause some disturbance, and I think it's prudent for me not to attend. Do you think that position is one that he could have took or should have taken?
It certainly is a position that he could have taken. Whether or not it is a position he should have taken, that is not for me to decide. Because at the end of the day, Shafia and her family invited him. He accepted, he went. He didn't break any law to do that. He did not interfere with anybody's rights to do that. And I really don't want to sound like I'm defending the Prime Minister, but the fact of the matter is, fair is fair, okay? He didn't do anything wrong to do that if he chose to do that, whether or not persons disagreed with his choice.
We can't live in a vacuum, you know.
We're not living in a
political
vacuum.
sentiments. We know
you may feel,
what's out there.
you may have a certain feeling about something. But if it is within the legitimate right and freedom of a person to do it, at the end of the day, even if you feel they shouldn't do it, you can't stop them from doing it. That's the reality. But it doesn't justify that because you didn't feel they should have done it, and they chose to do it, it doesn't justify you doing something that is disturbing, okay, because you felt they shouldn't have done it. It just doesn't justify it.
Is the issue really just an issue? Not so much the Prime Minister getting booing and the bell being rung on him and so on. Is it because it just, the fact that it was in a church, is that really what the issue is? That's
well, for me, it was an issue. It wasn't the place for any sort of protest, quote unquote, against the Prime Minister, because it was a funeral service. It didn't show, like I said, sensitivity and regard for the right to choose or the freedom of choice of the family members who wanted the gentleman there. It didn't show the Honorable Prime Minister I'm referring to. It wasn't the place for that, and it didn't show regard for their rights, okay, and their freedom to choose that. That's my issue so much, right? And not so much the issue of whether or not a person should be free to boo or protest against the Prime Minister. If they want to boo and protest, I'm saying that's not the place for that. And mind you, my opponent on the NDP in West St. George, he himself came out in social media and said it is inexcusable. This is Dr. Jules Ferdinand.
So he distanced himself.
Okay? And yet his party leadership is justifying this. I mean, what is the NDP leadership saying to Vincent Jones? Aren't we already partisan, politically divided enough? What are you saying? You should have been taking the position to tell people, look, we know how some of you feel, etc., but we are going to be the party that is going to advance uniting the people. And one would have thought that at a situation like death, that you would you would at least be the example, okay? Notwithstanding how you felt. But that didn't happen. And I find, I also want to say...
Who has come out, in your estimation, the victor of all this? And I'm going to get on to a piece that Rennie Groves wrote in the newspaper about a victor, a vanquished, but the country loses. And I thought it was a spot-on article. But before we get on to that, who was the victor in all of this? Because clearly somebody was trying to score political points.
Okay, I want to answer that question in part by referring to some of the words of Miss Shafia London Williams in her letter, where she gave her perspective on the funeral service of her father. And towards the end, she really called for us to consider ourselves, what's going on in our country in terms of politics and the divide, etc. In one sentence, she said, and I quote, "If the partisan divide is clearly wrenching, even at a time of mourning, on a larger scale, it's tearing our country apart." Okay? So for me, there's no victor there.
Right.
Well, then she goes on to say,
that's what Rennie is saying,
then she goes on to say, and I quote again, she said, At the end of the day, we must all live in this country. We must limit the scope of man's political jurisdiction to the essential duties of prudent government. Only then can we enable society to achieve true progress in business, communities, families, and churches. Prudent government is for what my father prudent government is for what my father so passionately fought. He did not fight for us to sink to the point as a nation where his family cannot even grieve for him at a funeral. Our moral sense, which God ordained for good, I call it conscience, should always urge us to put aside our political differences, such as during the grieving moments of a family. I'm saying there's no winner here. There's no victor here.
Right.
And victor at whose expense?
The country. And this is basically
this is the
what
point. You understand?
This is what Renwick Rose is talking about in his article.
His column.
Basically, he's drawing our mind to the fact that we are in this state because we are constitutionally bounded. We're following a constitution that perhaps does not befit us, and it's divisive, and we were left that by our colonizers. But I don't want to get into the details of the constitutional argument, right?
Okay.
But in essence, what he's saying is that we need to redefine ourselves.
Well, we need to redefine ourselves. We need to just have good behavior, man. Because I am saying, we grew up and we learned that a church wasn't a place for that.
Right.
Right? And people make choices.
So that was culturally obtuse.
The Westminster
Basically,
system and
behavior.
the Constitution doesn't force anybody to behave like that. Excuse me, I was at the Speaker of the House's daughter's funeral about a week ago, and again, my condolences to Mr. Speaker, his family, his wife, and so on, on the loss of a young woman, 37 years old.
Right.
You know, just 3 years my senior.
Yes,
I'll be 34 soon.
Okay.
And the opposition leader attended.
Right.
Nobody booed him and carried on, even after the display of NDP supporters at the funeral of Mr. Lynch.
Right.
At the entrance of the Prime Minister. I'm saying, come on, it's just a matter of choice. People could choose to behave right, and people could choose to do what is right and do what is more appropriate in more appropriate circumstances, etc. And in this case, the NDP failed. That behavior was not right. And they have lost, by the way, because there are persons, I know, die-hard NDP supporters otherwise, who are so upset over the behavior that they have said they're done. That is it. They can't believe that they would have stooped so low. Believe it or not.
Well, you were dismissed from the NDP on a matter that had to do with religion, actually.
Yes. I wanted to bring that up.
So are you seeing some sort of conundrum here in what happened?
The word is hypocrisy. That's what I'm saying.
Well, I'm
yes, hypocrisy.
I'm being a little bit more diplomatic.
Well, I'm not being diplomatic here because you have to tell it like it is, and people have to know what they're dealing with. The NDP leadership said the reason for firing me was because I expressed disagreement with a policy they claimed they had. The policy essentially said that no candidate or potential candidate should make public statements which are adverse to any religion. It wasn't about any statement I had made. It was another gentleman, and they tried to make an issue of it by bringing it to me because they knew the young man attended the same church as I do. And when I defended the young man's right to express himself, even in being critical of religious topics or doctrines, I was told, no, you can't do that because the party has a policy that says, as a party person, as a candidate, as a potential candidate, if you say things that are adverse or offensive to other religions, you could cost the party's vote. Well, I asked the question today, looking into the camera. What could be more adverse and offensive to religion, to the Anglican religion, to Anglicans, than the display of NDP supporters and the fact that no leader stood up to quiet them on that Saturday at Mr. Lynch's funeral? What could be more adverse? What could cause them to lose votes? And you're telling me all of you as candidates and representatives, parliamentarians, sat there and did not even attempt. If even you may not have got all to listen to you, you didn't even stand up and say, let me be the bigger man. Let me show an example. Let me be a statesman and say, come on, people, be quiet, try, do something. So it is hypocritical that I was fired over some so-called policy which I didn't break yet, according to them, but because I disagreed with the policy itself. But you have persons there condoning by their silence a display that is clearly adverse to religion, and suddenly it's like they forgot they have such a policy. It's the biggest joke, and it is hypocritical. And it shows that the real issue in firing me was no policy about adverse comments against religion. It was other issues and not that. And that is why today they can't even stand for their own policy in their behavior.
Anesia, I sort of gave you a free rein there.
For which I'm grateful.
For which I know you're grateful.
Yes.
But I want to pull the program back in, and sadly we're at the end of the third segment.
Okay.
So we're going to rein in the third segment, and we're going to go on to some other issues of the day.
Okay.
Which again has ULP and NDP stamped on it. So
yes.
When we come back.
Sure.
This is Unrendered on IKTV. We'll be into our final segment when we come back from the break.